The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Sir Oliver Sacks. Part 3. Transports. Introduction. While we have criticized the concept of function, even attempting a rather radical redefinition, we have adhered to it nevertheless. Drawing in the broadest term contrast based on deficit or excess, but it's clear that the wholly other terms also have to be used. As soon as we attended to phenomena as such, to the actual quality of experience or thought or action, we have to use terms more reminiscent of a poem or a painting. How, say, is a dream intelligible in terms of function? We have always two universes of discourse. Call them physical and phenomenal, or what you will, one dealing with questions of quantitative and formal structure, the other with those qualities that constitute a world. All of us have our own distinctive mental worlds, our own inner journeys and landscapes, and these for most of us require no clear neurological correlate. We can usually tell a man's story, relate passages and scenes from his life, without bringing in any physiological or neurological considerations. Such considerations would seem, at least, supererogatory, if not frankly absurd or insulting. For we consider ourselves, and rightly, free, at least determined by the most complex human and ethical considerations, rather than by the vicissitudes of our neural functions or nervous systems. Usually, but not always, for sometimes a man's life may be cut across, transformed by an organic disease, and if so, his story does require a physiological or neurological correlate. This, of course, is so with all patients here described. In the first half of this book, we describe cases of the obviously pathological situation in which there is some latent neurological excess or deficit. Sooner or later, it's obvious to such patients, or rather relatives, no less than to their doctors, that there is something physically the matter. Their inner worlds, their dispositions, may indeed be altered, transformed, but as becomes clear, it's due to some gross and almost quantitative change in neural function. In this third section, the presenting feature is reminiscence, altered perception, imagination, dream. Such matter don't often come to neurological or medical notice. Such transports, often of poignant intensity and shot through with personal feeling and meaning, tend to be seen, like dreams, as psychical, as a manifestation perhaps of unconscious or preconscious activity, or in the mystical minded of something spiritual, not as something medical, let alone neurological. They have an intrinsic dramatic or narrative or personal sense, and are not apt to be seen as symptoms. It may be in the nature of transports that they are more likely to be confined to psychoanalysts or confessors, to be seen as psychosis, or to be broadcast as religious revelations rather than brought to physicians. For it never occurs to us at first that a vision might be medical, and if an organic basis is suspected or found, this may be felt to devalue the vision, though of course it does not. Valuations have nothing to do with etiology. All the transports described in this section do have more or less clear organic determinants, though it was not evident to begin with, but required careful investigation to bring out. This does not detract in the least from their psychological or spiritual significance. If God of the eternal order was revealed to Dostoevsky in seizures, why shouldn't other organic conditions serve as portals to the beyond or the unknown? In a sense, this section is a study of such portals. Huggins Jackson in 1880 describing such transports or portals or dreamy states in the course of certain epilepsies used the general word reminiscence. He wrote, I should never diagnose epilepsy from the paradoxical occurrence of reminiscence without other symptoms, although I should suspect epilepsy if that superposition mental state began to occur very frequently. I have never been consulted of reminiscence only, but J have been so consulted, for the forced or paroxysmal reminiscence of tunes, of visions, of presences, or scenes, not only in epilepsy but in a variety of other organic conditions. Such transports or reminiscences are not uncommon in migraine. See the Visions of Helgard, Chapter 20. This sense of going back, whether on an epileptic or toxic basis, suffices a passage to India, Chapter 17. A plainly toxic or chemical basis underlies incontinent nostalgia, Chapter 16, and the strange hypersomnia of Chapter 18, the dog beneath the skin. Either seizures activity or a frontal lobe disinhibition determines the horrifying reminiscence of murder, Chapter 19. The theme of this section is the power of imagery and memory to transport a person as a result of abnormal stimulation of the temporal lobes and limbic system of the brain. This may even teach us something of the cerebral basis of certain visions and dreams, and of how the brain, which Shenton calls an ancient loom, may weave a magic carpet to transport us. (15) Reminiscence. Mrs. O.C. was somewhat deaf, but otherwise in good health. She lived in an old people's home. One night in January 1979 she dreamt vividly, nostalgically, of her childhood in Ireland, and especially of the songs they danced to and sang. When she woke up the music was still going, very loud and clear. I must still be dreaming, she thought, but this was not so. She got up, roused and puzzled. It was the middle of the night. Someone, she assumed, must have left her radio playing. But why was she the only person to be disturbed by it? She checked every radio she could find. They were all turned off. Then she had another idea. She had heard that dental fillings could sometimes act like a crystal radio, picking up stray broadcasts with unusual intensity. That's it, she thought. One of my fillings is playing up. It won't last long. I will get it fixed in the morning. She complained to the night nurse, who said her fillings looked fine. At this point another notion occurred to Mrs. O.C. What sort of radio station, she reasoned to herself, would play Irish songs deafeningly in the middle of the night? Songs, just songs, without introduction or comment, and only songs that I knew. What radio station would play my songs and nothing else? At this point she asked herself, is the radio in my head? She was now thoroughly rattled, and the music continued deafening. Her last hope was her E.N.T. man, the otologist she was seeing. He would reassure her, tell her it was just noises in the ear, something to do with her deafness, nothing to worry about. But when she saw him in the course of the morning, he said, no, Mrs. O.C., I don't think it's your ear, a cymbal ringing or buzzing or rumbling maybe, but A concert of Irish songs? That's not in your ears, maybe. He continued. You could see a psychiatrist. Mrs. O.C. arranged to see a psychiatrist the same day. Mrs. O.C., the psychiatrist said, it's not your mind. You're not mad, and the mad don't hear music. They only hear voices. You must see a neurologist, my colleague, Dr. Sachs. And so Mrs. O.C. came to me. Conversation was far from easy, partly because of Mrs. O.C.'s deafness, but more because I was repeatedly drawn out by songs. She could only hear me through the softer ones. She was bright, alert, not delirious or mad, but with a remote, absorbed look, as if someone half in the world of their own. I could find nothing neurologically amiss. Nonetheless, I suspected that the music was neurological. What could have happened with Mrs. O.C. to bring her to such a pass? She was 88 and in excellent good health with no hint of fever. She was not on any medication which might unbalance her excellent mind, and manifestly she had been normal the day before. Do you think it's a stroke, doctor? She asked, reading my thoughts. It could be, I thought, though I have never seen a stroke like this. Something has happened, that's for sure, but I don't think you are in danger. Don't worry.
And hold on. It's not so easy to hold on, she said. When you're going through what I'm going through, I know it's quiet here, but I'm in an ocean of sound. I wanted to do an electroencephalogram straight away, paying special attention to the temporal lobes, the musical lobes of the brain, but circumstances conspired to prevent this for a while. In this time the music grew less loud, and above all, less persistent. She was able to sleep after the first 3 nights, and increasingly to make and hear conversation between songs. By the time I came to do an EEG, she heard only occasional brief snatches of music, a dozen times, more or less, in the course of the day. After we had settled her and applied the electrodes to her head, I asked her to lie still, say nothing, and not sing to herself, but to raise her right forefinger slightly, which in itself wouldn't disturb the EEG if she heard any of her songs as we recorded. In the course of the 2-hour recording she raised her finger on 3 occasions, and each time she did this the EEG bins clattered, and transcribed spikes and sharp waves in the temporal lobes of the brain. This confirmed that she was indeed having temporal lobe seizures, which, as Hellings, Jackson, Guest, and Wilder Binfeld proved, are the invariable basis of reminiscence, an experimental hallucination. But why should she suddenly develop these strange symptoms? I obtained a brain scan, and this showed that she had indeed had a small thrombosis or infarction in part of her right temporal lobe. The sudden onset of Irish songs in the night, the sudden activation of musical memory traces in the cortex, were apparently the consequence of stroke, and as it resolved, so the songs resolved too. By mid-April, songs had entirely gone, and Mrs. O.C. was herself once again. I asked her at this point how she felt about it all, and in particular whether she missed the paroxysmal songs she heard. "It's funny you should ask that," she said with a smile. "Mostly I would say it's a great relief, but yes, I do miss the old songs a little. Now, with lots of them, I can't even recall them. It was like being given back a forgotten bit of my childhood again, and some of the songs were really lovely." I had heard similar sentiments from some of my patients on L-Dopa. The term I used was incontinent nostalgia, and what Mrs. O.C. told me, her obvious nostalgia, put me in mind of a poignant story of H. J. Wells, The Door in the Wall. I told her the story. "That's it," she said. "That captures the mood, the feeling entirely. But my door is real, as my wall was real. My door leads to the lost and forgotten past." I didn't see a similar case until June last year when I was asked to see Mrs. O. M., who was now a resident at the same home. Mrs. O. M. was also a woman in her 80s, but also somewhat deaf, also bright and alert. She, too, heard music in the head, and sometimes a ringing or hussing or rumbling. Occasionally she heard voices talking, usually far away and several at once, so that she could never catch what they were saying. She hadn't mentioned these symptoms to anybody, and had secretly worried for 4 years that she was mad. She was greatly relieved when she heard from the sister that there had been a similar case in the home some time before, and very relieved to be able to open up to me. One day Mrs. O. M. recounted, while she was grating barnacles in the kitchen, a song started playing. It was Easter Parade, and was followed in swift succession by Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, and Good Night, Sweet Jesus, like Mrs. O.C. She assumed that the radio had been left on, but quickly discovered that all the radios were off. This was in 1979. 4 years earlier, Mrs. E.T. recovered in a few weeks, but Mrs. O.M. music continued, and got worse and worse. At first she would hear only these three songs, sometimes spontaneously out of the blue, but for certain if she chanced to think of any of them, she tried, therefore, to avoid thinking of them. But the avoidance of thinking was as provocative as the thinking. "Do you like these particular songs?" I asked psychiatrically. "Do they have some special meaning for you?" "No," she answered promptly. "I never especially liked them, and I don't think they had any special meaning to me." "And how did you feel when they kept going on?" "I came to hate them," she replied with great force. "It was like some crazy neighbor continually putting in the same record." For a year or more there was nothing but these songs, in maddening succession. After this, and though it was worse in one way, it was also a relief. The inner music became more complex and various. She would hear countless songs, sometimes several simultaneously. Sometimes she would hear an orchestra or a choir, and occasionally voices or a mere hubbub of noises. When I came to examine Mrs. O.M., I found nothing abnormal except in her hearing. And here what I found was a singular interest. She had some inner ear deafness, of commonplace sort, but over and above this she had a peculiar difficulty in the perception and discrimination of tones of a kind which neurologists call amusia, and which especially correlated with impaired function in the auditory or temporal lobes of the brain. She herself complained that recently the hymens in the chapel seemed more and more alike, so that she could scarcely distinguish them by tone, but had to rely on the words, or the rhythm. And although she had been a fine singer in the past, when I tested her she sang flat and out of key. She mentioned too that her inner music was most vivid when she woke up, becoming less so as other sensory impressions crowded in, and that it was least likely to occur when she was occupied emotionally, intellectually, but especially visually. In the hour or so she was with me, I heard music only once, a few bars of Easter Parade, played so loud and so suddenly she could hardly hear me through it. When we came to do an EEG on Mrs. O.M., it showed strikingly high voltage and excitability in both temporal lobes, those parts of the brain associated with the center representation of sounds and music, and with the evocation of complex experiences and scene. And whenever she heard anything, the high voltage waves became sharp, spike-like, and frankly convulsive. This confirmed my thought that she had too musical epilepsy, associated with disease of the temporal lobes. But what was going on with Mrs. O.M. and Mrs. O.M.? Musical epilepsy sounds like a contradiction in terms for music normally, is a full of feeling and meaning, and corresponds to something deep in ourselves. The world behind the music, in Thomas Mann's phrase, whereas epilepsy suggests quite the reverse, a crude, random, physiological event, wholly unselective, without feeling or meaning. Thus, a musical epilepsy or personal epilepsy would seem a contradiction in terms. And yet such epilepsies do occur, though solely in context of temporal lobe seizures. Epilepsies of reminiscent part of the brain. Hollings-Jackson described these a century ago and spoke in this context of dreamy states, reminiscent, and physical seizures. It's not very uncommon for epileptics to have vague and yet exceedingly elaborate mental states at the onset of epileptic seizures. The elaborate mental state, or so-called intellectual aura, is always the same, or essentially the same in each case. Such descriptions remained purely anecdotal until the extraordinary studies of Wilder Benfield half a century later. Benfield was not only able to locate their origin in the temporal loops, but was able to evoke the elaborate mental state, or the extremely precise and detailed experimental hallucinations of such seizures by gentle electrical stimulation of the seizure rhomboids of the cerebral cortex. As this was exposed at surgery in full conscious patients, such stimulations would instantly call forth intensely vivid hallucination of tones, people, scenes, which would be experienced lived as compellingly real, in spite of brasic atmosphere of the operating room, and could be described to those present in fascinating detail, confirming that what Jackson described 60 years earlier when he spoke of the characteristic doubling of consciousness. There is 1. The quasi-parasitical state of consciousness, dreamy state, and 2. There are remains of normal consciousness. And thus there is double consciousness, a mental diplopia. This was precisely expressed to me by my two patients. Mrs. O.M. heard and saw me, albeit with some difficulty, although the deafening dream of Easter parade, or the quieter yet more profound dream of "Good night, sweet Jesus," which called up for her the presence of church she used to go to on the 31st Street, where this was always sung from a novena. And Mrs. O.C. also saw and heard me through the much profounder animistic seizures of her childhood in Ireland. I know you're there, Dr. Sachs. I know I'm an old woman with a stroke in an old people's home, but I feel I'm a child in Ireland again. I feel my mother's arm. I see her. I hear her voice singing. Such epileptic hallucinations or dreams, Benfeld showed, are never fantasias. They are always memories, and memories of the most precise and vivid kind, accompanied by the emotions which accompanied the original experience. Their extraordinary and constant detail which was evoked each time the cortex was stimulated, and exceeded anything which could be recalled by ordinary memory, suggested to Benfield that the brain retained an almost perfect record of every lifetime's experience, that the total stream of consciousness was preserved in the brain, and as such could always be evoked or called forth by the ordinary needs and circumstances of life, or by the extraordinary circumstances of an epileptic or electrical stimulation. The variety, the absurdity of such convulsive memories and scenes made Benfield think that such reminiscence was essentially meaningless and random. At operation, it's usually quite clear that the evoked experiential response is a random reproduction of whatever composed the stream of consciousness during some interval of the patient's past life. It may have been, Benfield continues, summarizing the extraordinary miscellany of epileptic dreams and scenes he has evoked, a time of listening to music, a time of looking in at the doors of a dance hall, a time of imagining the action of robbers from a comic strip, a time of waking from a vivid dream, a time of a laughing conversation with friends, a time of listening to a little son to make sure he was safe, a time of watching eliminated signs, a time of lying in the delivery room at birth, a time of being frightened by a menacing man, a time of watching people enter the room with snow on their clothes. It may have been a time standing on the corner of Jacob and Washington, South Bend, Indiana, of watching circus wagons one night years ago in childhood, a time of listening and watching your mother speed the parting guests, or of hearing your mother and father singing Christmas carols. I wish I could quote this in its entirety, this wonderful passage from Binfield and Barrett. It gives, as my Irish ladies do, an amazing feeling of personal physiology, the physiology of the self. Binfield is impressed by the frequency of musical seizures and gives many fascinating and often funny examples. 3% incidence in the more than 500 temporal lobe epileptics he has studied. He was surprised at the number of times electric stimulation had caused patients to hear music. It was produced from 17 different points in 11 cases. Sometimes it was an orchestra, at other times voices singing, a piano playing, or a choir. Several times it was said to be a radio theme song. The localization of production of music is in the superior temporal convolution, either the lateral or the superior surface, and as such close to the point associated with so-called musicogenic epilepsy. This is borne out dramatically and often comically by the examples Binfield gives. The following list is extracted from his great final paper. White Christmas, Case 4, sung by a choir. Rolling along together, Case 5, not identified by patients but recognized by operating room nurse when patients hummed it on stimulation. Hush a bye baby, Case 6, sung by mother but also thought to be theme tune for a radio program, a song he had heard before, a popular one on the radio. O Mary, Case 30. The theme song of a radio program, The War March of the Priests, Case 31. This was on the other side of Hallelujah Chorus, on a record belonging to the patient, mother and father singing Christmas Carol, Case 32. Music from Guys and Dolls, Case 37. A song she had heard frequently on the radio, Case 45. I Will Get By and You Will Never Know, Case 46. Songs he had often heard on the radio. In each case, as with Mrs. O.M., the music was fixed and stereotyped. The same tone or tones were heard again and again, whether in the course of a spontaneous seizure or with electrical stimulation of the seizure bronchocortex. Thus, these tones were not only popular in the radio, but equally popular as hallucinatory seizures. They were, so to speak, the top 10 of the cortex. Is there any reason we must wonder why particular songs or scenes are selected by a particular patient for reproduction in the hallucinatory seizures? Benfield considered this question and feels that there is no reason, and certainly no significance in the selection involved. It would be very difficult to imagine that some of the trivial incidents and songs recalled during stimulation or epileptic discharge could have any possible emotional significance to the patient, even if one is acutely aware of this possibility. The selection, he concludes, is quite at random, except that there is some evidence of cortical conditioning. These are the words. This is the attitude, so to speak, of physiology. Perhaps Manfield is right. But could there be more? Is he in fact acutely aware, aware enough, at the level of the matter, of the possible emotional significance of songs, of what Thomas Mann called the world behind the music? Would superficial questioning such as, "Does this song have any special meaning to you?" suffice? We know all too well from the study of free association that the most seemingly trivial or random thoughts may turn out to have an unexpected depth and resonance, but that this only becomes evident given an analysis in depth. Clearly, there is no such deep analysis in Benfield nor in any other physiological psychology. It's not clear whether any such deep analysis is needed, but given the extraordinary opportunity of such miscellany of convulsive songs and scenes, one feels at least that it should be given a try. I have gone back to Mrs. O.M. briefly to elicit her association, her feelings to her songs. This may be unnecessary, but I think it's worth trying.
One important thing has already emerged. Although consciously she can attribute to the three songs special feeling or meaning, she now recalls, and this is confirmed by others, that she was apt to hum them, unconsciously, long before they became hallucinatory seizures. This suggested that they were already unconsciously selected, a selection which would then seized on by a supervening organic pathology. Are they still her favorite? Do they matter to her now? Does she get anything out of her hallucinatory music? The month after I saw Mrs. O.M., there was an article in the New York Times entitled "Did Shostakovich Have a Secret?" The secret of Shostakovich, it was suggested by the Chinese neurologist Dr. Dazhu Wang, was the presence of a metallic splinter, a mobile shell fragment in his brain, in the temporal horn of the left ventricle. Shostakovich was very reluctant, apparently, to have this removed. Since the fragment had been there, he said, each time he leaned his head to one side he could hear music. His head was filled with melodies, different each time, which he then made use of when composing. X-rays allegedly showed the fragment moving around when Shostakovich moved his head, pressing against his musical temporal lobe. When he tilted, producing an infinity of melodies which his genius could use. Dr. R. A. Henson, editor of The Music and the Brain, 1977, expressed deep but not absolute skepticism. I would hesitate to affirm that it could not happen. After reading the article I gave to Mrs. O.M. to read, and her reactions were strong and clear. "I'm not Shostakovich," she said. "I cannot use my songs. Anyhow, I'm tired of them. They're always the same. Musical hallucinations may have been a gift to Shostakovich, but they are only a nonsense to me. He didn't want treatment, but I want it badly." I put Mrs. O.M. on anticonvulsants, and she forthwith ceased her musical convulsions. I saw her again recently and asked her if she missed them. "Not in your life," she said. "I'm much better without them." But this, as we have seen, wasn't the case with Mrs. O.C., whose hallucination was an altogether more complex, more mysterious, and deeper kind, and even if random in its causation, turned out to have great psychological significance and use. With Mrs. O.C., indeed, the epilepsy was different from the start, both in terms of physiology and personal character and impact. There was for the first 72 hours an almost continuous seizures, or seizure status, associated with an apoplexy of the temporal lobe. This in itself was overwhelming. Secondly, and this too had some physiological basis, in the abruptness and extent of the stroke, and its disturbance of deep-lying emotional center, ANCOS, amygdala, limbic system, deep within and deep to the temporal lobe. There was an overwhelming emotion associated with the seizures, and an overwhelming and profoundly nostalgic content, an overwhelming sense of being a child again, in her long forgotten home in the arms and presence of her mother. It may be that such seizures have both a physiological and a personal origin, coming from particularly charged parts of the brain, but equally meeting particular psychic circumstances and needs, as in case reported by Dennis Williams, 1956. A representative, 31, had major epilepsy induced by finding himself alone among strangers. Onset, a visual memory of his parents at home. The feeling, how marvelous to be back. It's described as a very pleasant memory. Higgs Gusken goes hot and cold, and either the attack subsides or proceeds to a convulsion. Williams relates this astonishing story boldly, and makes no connection between any of its parts. The emotion is dismissed as purely physiological, inappropriate ictal pleasure, and the possible relation of being back home to being lonely is equally ignored. He may, of course, be right. Perhaps it all is entirely physiological, but I can't help thinking that if one has to have seizures, this man managed to have the right seizures at the right time. In Mrs. O.C.'s case, the nostalgic need was more chronic and profound, for her father died before she was born, and her mother before she was 5. Orphaned, alone, she was sent to America, to live with a rather forbidding maiden aunt. Mrs. O.C. had no conscious memory of the first 5 years of her life, no memory for mother, of Ireland, of home. She had always felt this was a keen and painful sadness, this lack or forgetting of the earliest, most precious years of her life. She had often tried, but never succeeded, to recapture her lost and forgotten childhood memories. Now, with her dreams, and the long dreamy states which succeeded it, she recaptured a crucial sense of her forgotten lost childhood. The feeling she had was not just ictal pleasure, but a trembling, profound, and poignant joy. It was, as she said, like the opening of a door which had been stubbornly closed all her life. In her beautiful book on Involuntary Memories, a collection of moments, 1970, Esther Salmon speaks of the necessity to preserve or recapture the sacred and precious memories of childhood, and how impoverished, ungrounded life is without these. She speaks of the deep joy, the sense of reality which recapturing such memories may give. And she provides an abundance of marvelous autobiographical quotations, especially from Dostoevsky and Proust. "We are all exiles from our past," she writes, "and as such we need to recapture it." For Mrs. O.C., nearly 90, approaching the end of a long, lonely life, this recapturing of sacred and precious childhood memories, this strange and almost miraculous amnesis, breaking open the closed door, the amnesia of childhood, was provided, paradoxically, by cerebral mishap. Unlike Mrs. O.M., who found her seizures exhausting and tiresome, Mrs. O.C. found hers a refreshment to the spirit. They give her a sense of psychological grounding and reality, the elemental sense which she had lost in her long decades of cut-off fence and exile, that she had a real childhood and home, that she had been mothered and loved and cared for. Unlike Mrs. O.M., who wanted treatment, Mrs. O.C. declined anticonvulsants. "I need these memories," she would say. "I need what's going on. And it will end by itself soon enough." Dostoevsky had a psychological seizures. or elaborate mental states at the onset of seizures. And once said of these, you all healthy people can't imagine the happiness which we epileptics feel during the second before our fit. I don't know if this felicity lasts for seconds, hours, or months, but believe me, I wouldn't exchange it for all the joys that life may bring. Mrs. O.C. would have understood that. She too knew in her seizures an extraordinary felicity, but it seemed to her the acme of sanity and health, the very key, indeed the door, to sanity and health. Thus she felt her illness as health, as healing. As she got better and recovered from her stroke, Mrs. O.C. had a period of wistful and fears. "The door is closing," she said. "I'm losing it again." And indeed she did lose. By the middle of April, the sudden eruptions of childhood scenes and music and feeling, her sudden epileptic transports back to the world of early childhood, which were undoubtedly reminiscent and authentic, for, as Binfield has shown beyond doubt, such seizures grasp and produce a reality, an experiential reality, not a fantasy, actual segments of an individual's lifetime and past experience. But Binfield always speaks of consciousness in this regard, of physical seizures as seizing, and convulsively replying. Part of the stream of consciousness, of conscious reality. What is peculiarly important and moving in this case of Mrs. O.C. is that epileptics, reminiscence here sees on something unconscious, very early childhood experience, either faded or repressed from reason, from consciousness, and restored them, convulsively, to full memory and consciousness. And it's for this reason one must suppose that though physiologically the door did close, the experience itself was not forgotten, but left a profound and enduring impression, and was felt as a significant and healing experience. "I'm glad it happened," she said when it was over. It was the healthiest, happiest experience of my life. There is no longer a great chunk of childhood missing. I can't remember the details now, but I know it's all there. There is a sort of completeness I never had before. There was not idle words, but brave and true. Mrs. O.C.'s Caesar did effect a kind of conversation, did give a centre of centralist life, did give her back the childhood she had lost, and with this a serenity which she had never had before, and which remained for the rest of her life, an ultimate serenity and security of spirit, as it only given to those who possesses or recall the true past. Postscript. "I have never been consulted for reminiscence only," said Huggins Jackson. In contrast, Freud said, "Neurosis is reminiscence," but clearly the word is being used in quite opposite scenes. For the aim of psychoanalysis, one must say, is to replace false or fantastic reminiscences by a true memory, or amnesis, of the past. And it's precisely such true memory, trivial or profound, that is evoked in the course of psychical seizures. Freud, we know, greatly admired Huggins Jackson, but we don't know if Jackson, who lived in 1911, have ever heard of Freud. The beauty of a case like Mrs. O.C.'s is that it's at once Jacksonian and Forwardian. She suffered from a Jacksonian reminiscence, but this served to moor and heal her. As Forwardian amnesis, such cases are exciting and precious, for they serve as a bridge between the physical and personal, and they will point, if we let them, to the neurology of the future, a neurology of living experience. This wouldn't, I think, have surprised or outraged Huggins Jackson. Indeed, it's surely what he himself dreamed of when he wrote of dreamy states and reminiscence back in 1880. Binfield and Barrett entitled their paper "The Brain's Record of Visual and Auditory Experience." And we may now meditate meditate on the form, or forms such inner records may have. What occurs in this wholly personal experiential seizures is an entirely replay of a segment of experience. What we may ask could be played in such a way as to reconstitute an experience. Is it something akin to a film or record, played on the brain's film, projector, or photograph, or something analogous but logically anterior, such as a script or score? What is the final form, the natural form, of our life's repertoire? That repertoire which provides not only memory and reminiscence, but our imagination at every level from the simplest sensory and motor images to the most complex imaginative worlds, landscapes, scenes. A repertoire, a memory, an imagination of a life which is essentially personal, dramatic, or iconic. The experiences of reminiscence our patients have raise fundamental questions about the nature of memory, or reminiscences. These are also raised, in reverse, in our tales of amnesia or amnesis, the lost mariner and matter of identity. Analogous questions about the nature of knowing, agnosis, are raised by our patients with agnosis. The dramatic visual agnosia of Dr. B, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, and the auditory and musical agnosis of Mrs. O. M. and Emily D., the president's speech, and similar questions about the nature of action or praxis are raised by the motor bewilderment or apraxia of certain retards and by patients with frontal lobe apraxis. Apraxis which may be so severe that such patients may be unable to walk, may lose their kinetic melodies, their melodies of walking. This also happens in Parkinsonian patients, as we see in Awakenings. As Mrs. O.C. and Mrs. O.M. suffered from reminiscence, a convulsive upsurge of melodies and scenes, a sort of hypermnesis or hyperagnosia, our amnesic agnosis patients have lost or are losing their inner melodies and scenes. Both alike testify to the essential melodic and scenic nature of inner life, the Proustian nature of memory and mind. Stimulate a point in the cortex of such patient, and there convulsively unrolls a Proustian evocation or reminiscence. What meditates this, we wonder? What sort of cerebral organization could allow this to happen? Our current concepts of cerebral processing or representation or are essentially computational. See, for example, David Moore's brilliant book, Vision and Computational Investigation of Visual Representation in Man, 1982. And as such, they are couched in terms of schemata, programs, algorithms, etc. But could schemata, programs, algorithms only provide for us the richly visionary, dramatic, and musical quality of experience? The vivid personal quality which makes it experience? The answer is clearly, even passionately, no. Computational representations, even of the exotic sophistication envisaged by Moore and Bernstein, the two great pioneers and thinkers in this realm, could never of themselves constitute iconic representation. Those representations which are the very thread and stuff of life. Thus a gulf appears, indeed a chasm, between what we learn from our patients and what physiologists tell us. Is there any way of bridging this chasm? Or, if that is, as it may be categorically impossible, are there any concepts beyond those of cybernetics by which we may better understand the essentially personal Proustian nature of reminiscence of the mind, of life? Can we in short have a personal or Proustian physiology, over and above the mechanical shrinking one? shrinking himself, hints at this in Man of His Nature, 1940, when he imagines the mind as an enchanted loom, weaving ever-changing yet always meaningful patterns. Weaving, in effect, patterns of meaning. Such patterns of meaning would indeed transcend purely formal or computational programs or patterns, and allow the essentially personal quality which is inherent in reminiscence, inherent in all mnesis, gnosis, and praxis. And if we ask what form, what organization, such patterns could have, the answer springs immediately, and, as it were, inevitably, to mind. Personal patterns, patterns of the individual, would have to take the form of scripts or scores. As abstract patterns, patterns for a computer must take the form of schemata or programs. Thus, above the level of cerebral programs, we must conceive a level of cerebral scripts and scores. The score of Easter braid I conjugate is indelibly inscribed in Mrs. O.M.'s brain. The score, her score, of all she heard and felt at the original moment and imprinting of the experience. Similarly, in the dramaturgic portions of Mrs. O.C.'s brain, apparently forgotten, but nonetheless totally recoverable, must have lain indelibly inscribed the script of her dramatic childhood scene. And let us note from Binfield's case that the removal of the minute, convulsing point of cortex, the irritant focus causing reminiscence, can remove, in toto, the iterating scene, and replace an absolutely specific reminiscence or hypermnesia by an equally specific avulsion or amnesia. There is something extremely important and frightening here. The possibility of a real psychosurgery, a neurosurgery of identity, infinitely finer and more specific than our gross amputations and lobotomies, which may damp or deform the whole character, but can't touch individual experiences. Experience is not possible until it's organized iconically. Action is not possible unless it's organized iconically. The brain's record of everything alive, must be iconic. This is the final form of the brain's record, even though the preliminary form may be computational or programmatic. The final form of cerebral representation must be, or allow, art, the artful scenery and melody of experience and action. By the same token, if the brain's representation are damaged or destroyed, as in amnesis, agnosis, apraxia, this reconstitution, if possible, demands a double approach, an attempt to reconstruct damaged programs and systems, as is being developed extraordinarily by Soviet neurophysiology, or a direct approach at the level of inner melodies and scenes. Either approach may be used, or both may be used in conjugation, if we are to understand or assist brain-damaged patients, a systematic therapy and an art therapy, preferably both. All of this was hinted at 100 years ago in Hunglick's Jackson's original account of reminiscence, 1880, by Korsakov on amnesia, 1887, and by Freud and Anton in 1890s. On agnosis, their remarkable insights have been half forgotten, eclipsed by the rise of a systematic physiology. Now is the time to recall them, reuse them, so that there may rise, in our own time, a new and beautiful existential science and therapy, which can join with the systematic to give us a comprehensive understanding and power. Since the original publication of this book, I have been consulted by innumerable cases of musical reminiscence. It's evidently not uncommon, especially in the elderly, though fear may inhibit the seeking of advice, Occasionally, as with Miss OC and OM, a serious or significant pathology is found. Occasionally, as in recent case Ribert, there is a toxic basis such as the overuse of aspirin. Patients with severe nerve deafness may have musical phantoms, but in most cases no pathology can be found, and the condition, though annuncians, is essentially benign. Why the musical parts of the brain above all should be so prone to such releases in old age remains far from clear.